This took place back in 2019 when I was 11. My grandparents live in a large Victorian-styled home on the outskirts of Portland, Oregon. The building was made in the late 1800s, so it has that classic old building look to it. Me and my family go down there occasionally from our home up near Bellingham, Washington, and in early September of that year, my family decided that they wanted to pay my grandparents a visit. I was excited to see my grandparents, but not so much to go to the house. Up until that point, nothing out of the ordinary had happened in that house. The only thing it did was creep me out, especially if I was alone. The first day we were there, nothing out of the ordinary happened. My grandparents and I did our annual game of Clue, a murder mystery board game. We enjoyed dinner, and that was basically it. But little did I know when I went to sleep that night that tomorrow would be anything but ordinary. When I got up the next day, I was excited because I was a die-hard Seahawks fan, and today was going to be their first game of the season. Outside it was warm and muggy, so in my room, which was one of the 2 rooms on the 3rd floor, I had the window open with the fan on to let all of the hot air out. Later that day, my dad came up to my room and said that he and everyone else was going to go on a walk. I acknowledged him by nodding, glued to the Seahawks game that was on my tablet screen. He then left, and shut the door behind him. What happens next still terrifies me to this day. About 10 minutes later, I heard what I thought to be my mom yelling from downstairs. Somewhat annoyed, I stood up and turned the fan off next to the window to listen if my mom was actually calling me, or if my mind was playing tricks on me. Then I heard it again, my mom was definitely calling my name. I opened the door, frustrated I was missing part of the game, and yelled and annoyed, "Yeah." When there was no response, I yelled down from the 3rd floor stairs again, "Yeah." Then my mom called back and said something like, "Want to show you this," or something like that. I couldn't really make out what she was saying. Annoyed, but not wanting to ignore my mom, I hurried down the stairs on to the 2nd floor. "Where are you?" I called, genuinely not knowing where she was. "Here," she said. It sounded like it was coming from the 1st floor. But something was off. Her voice sounded very muffled and weird. I played it off as me just being paranoid, so I walked down to the 1st floor, now getting a little scared. "Mom?" I said. No reply. I searched almost every room, and no one was there. That only left one room, the basement. There was no way in heck I was going down there though, so I started heading back towards the stairs when all of a sudden, the basement door swung open. I yelled, spinning around. No one was there. Then, I heard footsteps walking down the basement stairs. Someone was definitely there. I then heard my mom say again, "Here," in that same weird muffled voice. I got chills down my spine, something definitely wasn't right. I turned and ran as fast as I could up the stairs and onto the 2nd floor. I ran across the kitchen to the narrow staircase that lead up to the 3rd floor, then I stopped dead in my tracks, paralyzed with fear. At the top of the staircase was a shadow-like person without a face saying in my mother's voice, "Here." I screamed at the top of my lungs, and practically threw myself down the stairs and out the front door. I then waited outside near the trees, glancing over my shoulder every 2 seconds before my family finally came back from their walk. When I told them what had happened, they didn't believe me at first. But seeing as I was crying and looking genuinely freaked out, they told me that they believed me. I don't know if they were telling the truth or they just wanted me to feel comforted, but either way there was no way I was sleeping in that building. After about 10 minutes of reasoning with them, I decided I would be more comfortable if I slept with my parents that night. This incident still haunts me to this day. I rarely ever sleep in a room alone in that house anymore. When I was 12 years old, my parents and my older brother and sister moved into my grandparents' house, my dad's mom and dad, as they had both passed away. By the way, they didn't die at the same time. My granddad passed first, he had cancer, and then a couple years later, my nan got diagnosed with cancer. She passed away 2 years later, which brings us to the story. The reason we moved into that house is because my dad didn't want to part with it and sell it to someone else because it's the house he grew up in along with his sisters, my aunts. We moved in and everything was fine. It actually brought back a lot of memories from when me and my brother and sister would stop over when we were little. My nan and granddad would always buy us sweets and we would watch movies with them, smiley face. The house, at least for the first week, was very busy and we had family members over and my dad and my aunts trying to sort out my nan's belongings, etc. However, the week after was pretty chill as nobody came around. I shared a room with my brother and my sister had her own room and then obviously, my parents had theirs. One day, me and my brother were playing on our PlayStation when my sister came in our room and told us to stop banging the walls. We were confused because we were playing on the PlayStation anyway. She left and then minutes later, we heard banging on our wall. We thought it was our sister trying to annoy us, so we ignored it until it got louder. Then we went to her bedroom to confront her. She said she wasn't doing anything and then the banging started again. Our mom started yelling at us to stop banging. We told her we weren't and then it stopped. A couple days later, we were having dinner downstairs and the shower started running. It wasn't running completely, just dripping. We didn't think anything of it because it was an older house and nothing had been updated in years. My dad told my brother to make sure the shower was off. He did, and he came back downstairs and everything was fine. The shower started up again, so my dad went to check it out and again it stopped. A few weeks later, me and my mom were walking back from the shops. The shops were down the street from us, and we bumped into a neighbor. I'm going to call her Mary. Mary was old and nice. She was very sweet and lived a few rows down with her husband, but she wasn't all there, if you get what I mean. She told my mom that she saw my nan in the window and waved to her, but she didn't wave back. My mom explained that my nan had died, but Mary was adamant that she saw her. Knowing what she was like, we just ignored her and went home. Then one night, my mom woke up and saw a man at the bottom of her bed. His back facing her so she couldn't see his face. At the time she thought it was my dad messing around, so she went back to sleep. The next day, while I was getting ready for school, I heard my mom ask my dad about him being awake and messing about with his clothes in the night. My dad was adamant that it wasn't him and that he was sleeping. At the time my mom thought she was probably dreaming it, but now if you ask her, she'd say it's my granddad because she was certain she was awake. My granddad was always messing with his clothes. He loved to dress up and wore suits even if he was just sitting in the house. Even when he was dying, he always asked for my dad, my aunt, mom, nan, nurses to help him dress in his suits. He liked to dress properly for my nan. My nan also liked to dress up, but not as much as my granddad. I am now 17 and we still live in my nan and granddad's house. Nothing weird or creepy has happened since, but I thought I'd come on here and tell this story. I've always loved my grandma. Of course, that's an obvious thing. Most people love their grandparents, but I've always felt a connection to my grandma. She and I are like the same person, just born 2 generations apart. We think the same, we enjoy the same foods, and we even look similar. Well, we would if we were the same age anyway. My whole life we got along and I really looked up to her. So, it's not a surprise that when her health started to decline in the last years of her life, it was me who took on the responsibility of caring for her. My parents were never around much and she basically raised me, so she was my mother as far as I was concerned. She lived by herself for as long as I have been alive. Her husband died before I was born and she never talked about him much. Only ever mentioning him if he was part of a story she was telling or she was talking about something that had belonged to him. Since she was always alone and I never wanted to be at home, I spent most of my childhood living at her house. It wasn't a large place, but plenty of room for 2 people to live, especially since one was a child. Walking through it now, I see how small it really was. The front door opens into the living den and that's connected to the kitchen and dining room. Though there is a hallway with 4 doors. The first door on the right is the bathroom, the second on the left is my old bedroom, now a storage room of sorts. The third also on the left is her bedroom, which is much larger than mine and has its own bathroom inside, and the last door on the right is another room. I never really knew the purpose of this room. It wasn't forbidden or anything like that. I could go in if I pleased, but something felt wrong in there. Like I wasn't supposed to be there. There were boxes of my grandpa's old stuff, a filing cabinet with old tax papers and legal stuff, a bed frame propped up against the wall but no bed, and a painting that hung on the wall. Still to this day I am both appalled and deeply entranced by this painting. It's very large, probably 4 feet high and 2.5 feet or so wide. It hangs on the back wall right in the center. There is nothing else on that wall or anything leaning against it. It's a painting of a woman. She looks sort of like me and therefore sort of like my grandma as well. She's wearing a classic Victorian dress that's white with faded pink embroidered flowers. She's very pretty, of course she is, she looks like me LOL. Her skin is a soft white shade, pale but not sickly. Her eyes are chartreuse and narrowed ever so slightly. She's not wearing any jewelry, but does have a Victorian-style hat on with her formal updo hair curling up from beneath it. The painted woman sits staring directly ahead. Her legs aren't in frame and the background is a wispy cloudy kind of backdrop that reminds me of the background on yearbook pictures. Her eyes seem to follow you no matter where you are, and it always feels like she's about to turn her head to look directly at you. For this reason I mostly stayed out of that room growing up. Mostly. When I was around 11 or 12 I started getting curious. You know how kids are at that age. I started looking through drawers, digging around in closets, and opening up the boxes of my grandpa's old stuff. There really wasn't a reason. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I was just curious and wanted to see if there was anything to find. Due to this new habit of mine I spent much more time in the room at the end of the hall. My grandma didn't really like me going through my grandpa's old stuff very much. Like I said, she was private about him and his belongings. She never explicitly told me I couldn't look through it, but always warned me about breaking anything and told me I better clean up the room if I take stuff out of the boxes. I respected her wishes. After my investigative sessions I would meticulously put everything back where it went and stack the boxes neatly before closing the door. After a while I realized there wasn't much to find. No big family mystery or hidden treasure, nothing like that. I remember one day looking at the boxes and knowing that, sadly, there was nothing left to dig through. The only mystery that remained was the painting. I asked my grandma and all she said was it was an heirloom and not to mess with. She said it with a stern tone and I knew she would be upset if I ripped it or messed up the frame. From that day onwards I felt a sort of tension when I entered the room with the painting. It was like I was walking on eggshells. Like the sound had been amplified and if I broke anything the painting would blare out what I had done. I kind of decided to not mess around in that room anymore after that. Probably a year went by without anyone ever opening the room. Then, one day my grandma asked me to move some things from her closet into the room just to clear space. Upon entering the room I immediately felt the tension. It was as if the air was 3 times as thick and breathing it into my lungs was fueling my body with anxiety. Something was different. I shuddered at the feeling and quickly finished my task so I could leave that room. Over the next few months strange things started to happen. When I was at the house alone or when I was up later at night after my grandma had went to sleep it felt like someone else was watching me. The familiar tension from that room would engulf the rest of the house. I started staying in my room if I was alone in the house and locking my door whenever it was time to go to bed. I would get a rush of dread every time I turned to go down the hallway towards my bedroom. My eyes stayed locked on the door at the end of the hall. Always closed but always giving the impression that it was ready to burst open. This built-up anxiety was causing me to lose sleep. I started staying up very late and noticing noises I had never heard before. The house seemed to make noises at night. There would be sounds of doors opening and closing, footsteps, chairs sliding and creaking, and sometimes I could swear someone was standing right outside my door. If I closed my eyes and focused, I could feel their presence staring at me through the wooden barrier. One night, after a bad dream, I was awake very late at night, unable to fall back asleep. I remember hearing the door at the end of the hall open. The door squeaked as it does when opened all the way. The carpeted hallway muffled thuds that approached my door. I wondered if it was my grandma coming to wake me up for some reason. I waited, but the footsteps stopped at my door and no one knocked or called for me. I listened hard and heard scratching on the carpet. I must have been feeling brave that night because I got up and walked to my door. I bent down and looked through the gap at the bottom. For the briefest moment I saw those chartreuse eyes looking back at mine. There was a swift flash of white fabric and muffled footsteps, followed by a door closing softly. I had jumped back and was breathing heavily. I didn't know what to do. Being a kid, I thought I would get in trouble for being up so late if I went to tell my grandma. I decided to just go to bed, fall asleep and forget it ever happened. In the morning I told myself that it was a dream. Part of the nightmare that had awoken me, or, actually, had not awoken me. Shortly after that incident there was a gap where I lived with my dad for a while and didn't return to my grandma's house for several months. I was so ready to come back after living with my father for a short while that I had kinda wiped the fear from my mind. When I finally got to come live with her again, I was elated with joy. The first weeks were just like old times. We got along as well as ever and I didn't really think about the room with the painting at all. Of course this didn't last. Slowly but surely the atmospheric dread seeped back in and I started hearing noises again. This time, though, it was worse. It wasn't just at night. It seemed like every time I was alone in the house things started to happen. If I was in the den I would hear noises down the hall. Footsteps, scratching, doors opening and closing. That sort of stuff. If I was in my room it felt like something wanted me to stay there. A presence would stand outside my door and I would be too terrified to open it. I never mentioned any of this to my grandma. I didn't want to hurt our relationship or make her think I wanted to leave. Even this torture was better than staying with either of my parents. Soon, I decided I had to do something. I couldn't let this thing control my life. I had to confront it. One day I was alone in the house and the familiar odd things began to happen once again. The sound of a door opening, creaking, footsteps. But I wasn't going to let myself be terrorized today. I was in the den and heard noises coming from the hallway. I took a few moments to steady myself before getting up and rushing to the kitchen. My footsteps landed hard as I moved as fast as I could through the house. I don't know what my plan was, but I wanted to show I wasn't afraid. Bolting into the kitchen I let out a yell. It was intended to be an intimidating kind of, "aha caught you," kind of noise, but came out as more of a squeal. I saw something crouched peering at me from the hallway and a white blur as soon as I had let out my yell. Footsteps moving down the hallway let me know the thing was retreating back to the room with the painting. I started running again, determined to see what it was. I rounded the corner to the hallway in a second and saw the back legs of a human-looking creature scuttling down the hallway towards the back room. It bounded into the room and after a moment the top of its head emerged and those chartreuse-colored eyes locked with mine as I stared back at it. After what seemed like minutes the head disappeared and the door to the room slammed shut. I was shaking, frozen in place at what I had just seen. I nearly jumped out of my skin when the front door opened and my grandma came in. I was so happy to see her I hugged her for a minute straight. After that encounter I never heard noises at night again. The air was still palpable close to the door to the room with the painting in it, but I never went inside and nothing ever came out again. Now, I'm here 30 years later. My grandma has passed and it's my responsibility to see to her affairs. I am in the room with the painting and its head is turned to look directly at me. I am frozen with fear, unable to reach out and remove the frame from the wall.